Welcome to The Bo Show, the home of faith, family, and freedom. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light? Everyone knows these first famous lines from the Star-Spangled Banner by Francis Scott Key. But why did he write that line? What was happening? Where was he? Who was present? And why does it matter? As we honor Flag Day on June 14th, I wanted to take a look back at our history and how a certain flag was critical to the United States and whether it still waves o'er the land of the free today. Let me set the scene. From 1793 to 1815, the French and British were at war. Due to this conflict, British ships would often confiscate American merchant ships to prevent supplies from getting to American ports, which the Americans viewed as a violation of their rights as neutrals. In addition, a group of Southern and Western congressmen called the War Hawks wanted the United States to annex parts of British Canada and Spanish Florida. This came to a boiling point on June 18, 1812, when America declared war against the British to preserve free trade and sailors' rights. For about 2 years, the Americans mainly just annoyed the British, who had to focus their attention on defeating Napoleon. But once he was defeated in April of 1814, the British sent 5,000 veterans up the Chesapeake, led by Major General Robert Ross and Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane, to give the Americans a complete drubbing, as they called it. A drubbing they certainly provided at the Battle of Bladensburg, and even burned Washington, D.C. down. Then they turned their attention to Baltimore. Baltimore was more prepared. They had Major General Samuel Smith, a veteran of the Revolution, and had his troops well trained, about 15,000 troops in total. Fort McHenry, the key defense of the harbor, was defended by 1,000 men. It was Fort McHenry's guns that dominated the channels leading into Baltimore. On September 12th, the British landed at North Point and marched towards Baltimore. Major General Ross, their commander, was mortally wounded in the opening of that battle. But his replacement proved no less demanding, and they pushed the Americans back, marching troops within just 2 miles of the city. However, Admiral Cochrane knew that Fort McHenry must be taken to wage a successful campaign. So he attacked it on the dawn of September 13th. The bombardment lasted about 25 hours. Major George Armistead, the commander of Fort McHenry, estimated that almost 1,800 shells were fired at the fort. Realizing that shelling alone wouldn't work, the Brits tried a diversionary tactic up the ferry branch, but they got discombobulated and it went awry. But the Brits kept shelling Fort McHenry into the dawn of September 14th. The British withdrew, and the Americans hoisted the flag that would later become the famous Star-Spangled Banner. Cochrane's fleet never made another successful advance and was eventually soundly defeated by General Andrew Jackson in the latter part of the War of 1812. While the Battle of Baltimore was certainly an important one, its legacy in history was etched by a young Washington lawyer named Francis Scott Key. A week before the battle, he and Colonel John Skinner, U.S. Commissioner General of Prisoners, set out on a mission to the British fleet, seeking the release of a friend, Dr. William Beans, who had been arrested for allegedly violating a pledge of good conduct after the Battle of Bladensburg. They sailed on September 5th to reach the British fleet in the Chesapeake Bay on September 7th, and with a few days of negotiation arranged for Beans to go free. But because they had learned about the British plan to attack Baltimore, the British detained them for fear that they would alert the city and the troops. So in brokering this one negotiation, they seemed to have violated another by detaining them. The three Americans then witnessed the bombardment of Fort McHenry from a truce ship. The dawn of the 14th would be what inspired the lawyer to write. He said, quote, "Through the clouds of the war, the stars of that banner still shone in my view. And I saw the discomfited host of its assailants driven back in ignominy to their ships. Then, in the hour of deliverance and joyful triumph, my heart spoke, And does not such a country and such defenders of their country deserve a song?" he asked. Key began jotting down notes on that ship and finished the poem after his return to Baltimore on the 16th of September. It was first titled "Defense of Fort McHenry," and the poem was published the next day. And then later the poem was matched to the melody of "To Anacreon in Heaven." Well, we don't know the song as "Defense of Fort McHenry" or "To Anacreon in Heaven," although there are certainly both defense and heavenly themes in it. Imagine what Key and those two Americans saw: a sheer all-out assault on their new country. So he jotted down, "Oh say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming?" This was a question. Can you see it? Throughout this assault with smoke in the air, Key knew that if the Americans lost and Fort McHenry succumbed, the American flag would not be waving. It would instead be the British flag. Key writes about it being dawn because the attack had been going on overnight for 25 hours. So he wrote, "Whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming." Ramparts are the raised embankments of a fortress, in this case, Fort McHenry. So he's writing about the stars and stripes gleaming as the rockets bombarded the fortified walls of McHenry. He continued, "And the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there." And then, even with this confidence, Key still ends the first stanza with a question, not a statement. "Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave, o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?" It ends with a question mark, not a period. He's asking, does it still wave? I find this really interesting because I hear it two ways. Does the flag still wave? Because if it does, then that means that America still exists. But in a second sense, does it wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Meaning, does it still wave over this brave, free land? I hear that with modern ears. It's like when they asked Benjamin Franklin what the Constitutional Convention deliberations had resulted in. And he replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." So I hear Key's lyrics in two ways. Does it still wave? Because if it does, it means America exists, but also waves over what America represents, freedom. That's what the British were assaulting, not just in a material battle sense, but this was about America's freedom. Now, when I and many others sing this song at sports events or other occasions, we only sing the first verse, which again, I reiterate, is a question, not a statement. There are three other stanzas that I want to provide.
On the shore dimly seen, through the mists of the deep, where the foe's haughty host in dread silence reposes, what is that which the breeze o'er the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, half conceals, half discloses? Now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam, in full glory reflected, now shines in the stream. 'Tis the Star-Spangled Banner, oh long may it wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
In this verse, Key is slightly more optimistic. He derides the British, calling them a haughty host, and describes the light catching the gleam of the flag in the morning, but yet still half reveals, half discloses. He can't say for sure, because the smoke and the wind are obstructing the view. But in the final couplet, he sends a more defiant charge. May it wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. So he's cautiously optimistic that it will still wave, and may it wave over this free land. He's hopeful. Here's the third stanza.
And where is that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country should leave us no more. Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps' pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave. For the land of the free and the home of the brave.
This verse is the most problematic to some, and historically why you have heard some taking an issue with it. The first three lines have to be taken together. Some think that Key was describing enslaved deserters who left to fight for the Brits, and sarcastically asking, where are they now? Those that doubted and gave up on America. Foul footsteps pollution is a reference to the poisoning of American soil by the British. They were considered polluting America. Musicologist Mark Clegg remarks that when Key talks about the hireling and the slave, he is referring to British hired troops. They were paid troops hired by the Brits and who looted and stole from Americans. The slaves he references could be colonial Marines held captive by the Americans who escaped and were offered freedom by the Brits if they fought against the Americans. So Key is mocking both groups for fighting for the British, each for different reasons. Key is essentially saying that those deserters and the hired hands were doomed to the grave. He did not have good feelings about either group. This third verse was dropped from the performance of the national anthem starting in World War II because it mocked the British, with whom we had become allies. It's interesting to note this historically because the verse was not pro-slavery, but rather anti-British and anti-deserter. But it was dropped because, really, of its mockery of the Brits, whom we rekindled allyship to fight the Nazis. Which again makes this verse and this song rather prescient. That here we were in the 20th century fighting a new enemy threatening our freedom by reconciling with an old enemy who had threatened our freedom. It's interesting, isn't it? And Key is more emphatic in the last line with the notion that the flag in triumph doth wave. He's claiming victory at this point. And then lastly, the fourth stanza.
Oh, thus be it ever when freemen shall stand between their loved home and the war's desolation. Blessed with victory and peace, may the hem-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must when our cause it is just, and this be our motto: in God is our trust. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph shall wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
The words free men, some argue, is in a revisionist sense that it didn't represent all free men, since slavery still existed. But in a more generic sense, in spite of that connotation, free men meant the freedom of Americans, the freedom from the British. You could argue that all Americans, black and white, were still slaves to King George and were treated very poorly as his subjects. A free man, then, would be any American, and that refers to women as well. Though in modern times some have tried to strip gender out of lyrics, as Justin Trudeau's government did with the words "in all our sons command" to a genderless lyric in their anthem, O Canada, This fails to see the use of metonymy and synecdoche, or saying a word that represents something bigger, or a part representing the whole. Like the word suit could refer to a business exec, or Atlanta could mean the entire Braves baseball team. Free men represents all Americans. Key writes, "Blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us as a nation." Not only does this indicate American exceptionalism, but it has a strong Christian or theistic connotation. Most Americans believed in God at that time and also believed God was on their side. This lyric is a nod to that divine providence. He writes, "In God is our trust." That is what's inscribed on our currency, "In God we trust." It has been very clear that the founders and pivotal architects of our history were deists and believed in this divine notion of America, a land of providence that could extend that providence to others. And America still does that today. Those last two lines become an exclamation, "And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph shall wave." Now that line ends not in a question mark, but with an exclamation point. Do you see how different verse 4 is from verse 1, which is filled with questions? We have to place ourselves in that perilous moment in 1814, when the smoke cleared and victory was evident by that flag waving. It was symbolic. No one had to say anything. Its very presence indicated the reality that America had won. The British fleet retreated and eventually departed back for England. It was a pivotal moment in world history. But Key was writing this with defiance and optimism about what the country was at that moment, but also what it might become, a place of hope. He writes, "It shall wave," not does the banner wave, but it shall wave. He is sending a charge. It has to be this way, or America no longer exists, which means freedom no longer exists. That's why the Star-Spangled Banner and the fact that it became our national anthem is so important. It is representative of something so much bigger. For those who have tried to protest it or kneel or reject the anthem, it is very important to remember that without winning the Battle of Baltimore and without that flag waving in the aftermath, none of us could have the freedom that we are afforded today. Furthermore, it is an eternal flame. The flag that was hoisted that morning measured 42 by 30 feet and was made by Mary Pickersgill. They wanted a flag so big that the British would have no difficulty in seeing it from a distance. Do you see the significance? They wanted something so big and so bold that it could not be mistaken. That's why it's not just a flag or just a song. They are symbolic of an idea of freedom. And yes, America was imperfect then, and it's imperfect now. But if you don't recognize how this battle and America's victory is representative of liberty, then no other argument matters. Unless you'd prefer continued British rule, or even German rule, for that matter. Then conquer we must when our cause it is just. The cause is absolutely just. It is a fight for basic rights, which must be preserved or you lose the whole system. In 1925, Congress made Fort McHenry a national park. It is also a national monument and a national shrine, the only park in the country to have this double distinction. I got to visit the fort in May and walk those same steps and looked out over the Chesapeake, trying to imagine what it must have been like to receive such a shelling and still survive. American weaponry was inferior. It didn't have the loft or the range that the British cannons had, but it survived. And I looked up to that flag that stands there today, and a swell of patriotism overcame me. When you visit the park, it begins with a short movie with some history. And at the end, the scrim is raised to reveal the flag in the distance, which is really special. I've performed the national anthem many times, but after visiting Fort McHenry, I have a new appreciation and sentiment for it. I understand it better and what it represents. I know that we only sing the first verse at events that last 90 seconds tops, but I almost think that we should be singing the first and the last verse, because the meaning goes from question to answer. America isn't a question mark. It is an exclamation point. It is settled that it represents victory and liberty, whether we are fighting the Brits, communism, or terrorism. Perhaps we should be as optimistic and confident as Francis Scott Key was in 1814. Then again, few of us have seen battle, and none of us have seen our country on the brink of destruction the way that it was that September day. As we celebrate this Flag Day, June 14th, may we remember that perilous fight in 1814, and remember that the flag does still wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. I'm Bo, and that's the show.